Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me over here. I've actually been downstairs there for the last couple of days working around with the kids and scanning the steers and that sort of thing. So I'm over here for a couple of reasons, so not just for this, but thanks anyway. So my topic listed in the agenda is the change of phenotype in seed stock industry. So it's going to discuss how and why it's changing and maybe what to expect in the future. So a lot of the stuff the other guy's been talking about sort of crosses over in all this other stuff that I'll be talking about or that Max talked about and that sort of thing. It's all pretty similar sort of stuff. But here we're probably preaching to the converted a bit. It might be 100 people down there that should be up here as well to have a bit of a listen to what's going on and what they could be doing but maybe not doing. Both my grandparents bred and showed bulls, so I've got a fair sort of a background to this sort of stuff, but it's changed a hell of a lot since then. My grandfather Green sent my father over to Scotland when he was about 20, and he went over there to learn the trade of showing and feeding and what have you, bulls, and he went over there and learnt from a couple of old Scotchmen. So he came back from America in the 50s and he brought a couple of cattle on the boat back with him, and one of them was a heifer that was in calf, and she actually had a calf herself when she got here, and that calf was champion at Sydney Show or something 3 years running, which, you know, pretty exciting, but I've seen photos of her. She looked like a sort of red and white rhinoceros with horns. So, things have obviously changed a hell of a lot since then. They would have wanted to. 10 years later, sort of I was born, Dad then had worked around and he sort of started working for different cattle studs, preparing and showing cattle. So, and when I was about 3, he was the first person in the country, in Australia, to start up a business of feeding other people's bulls and things for shows and sales. So he had what was called Green's Feeding Centre or something. So every year at every Sydney, Melbourne show, he'd have 50, 60 head of cattle there in my teenage years, which was a bit of fun. Go around and socialise and that sort of thing. I didn't really know what we were doing with the cattle there, but the rest of it was all right. But it was about then or over the next few years from then that artificial insemination started to be used. So at that stage, any bull that could win a broad ribbon and at a royal show, they'd use and collect the semen and, AI to their breeders and thinking, how good this was. So, a good bull could have maybe up to 100 calves a year. But it's amazing now to think that some of these top bulls that we're using over there, they have a couple of thousand calves in the seed stock job, and that's not even counting the commercial calves that they've got. So it was about this time, when I was a little fella, that I first started hearing this comment that I heard many times afterwards that from my father, and he'd say quite regularly over the next 40 years that the next 5 years in this industry is going to be very interesting. It's all just starting to change. So he said that, even up until a couple of years before he died. So all his life, the next 5 years, was going to be very interesting with the change. So when I was about 6, this bit of the talk is mainly for the Scottish fella that I went over to, that Dad went and worked for, but the Scottish fella sent his son over to work for Dad when he was about 20. So this little Scottish bearded little fella turned up and I was a little 6-year-old or whatever. I'd follow him around with all these 50 or 60 bulls, and he'd boil the barley to feed these bulls and tip the barley in an old bathtub and tip a bit of chaff and stuff in there and mix it up with a shovel, and we'd go around and feed these bulls individually morning and night. So they sort of had progressed on from the hippopotamus type, but not by much. So throughout the school years, Dad would have us doing various things with him, and to help him with his business and with the cattle. As a young fellow, my most hated job was to help Dad trim bulls' feet. So Dad had an old tipping table he used to drag around behind the car and go to people's places, and he'd have to take someone with him to hold the foot steady. So here's this poor little bugger holding on this rope, holding the foot steady while Dad cut their feet. So, to make these bulls that had bad feet have good feet. So anyway, it was later on, when I was in my early 20s, I actually dragged the same table around, did the same thing myself. So I spent a couple of years doing that over there, and it was that way that I got to have a fair understanding of structural issues in cattle. So, I didn't fix a lot of issues, but I hid a lot of issues. So, it was a pretty eye-opening sort of thing. One of the main things with the structural side of things I learnt is that the cattle didn't actually have bad feet because the feet were crooked. They actually had bad feet because there was an issue further up in their frame. So it's a bit like some guy explained it to us years ago, is it's like a car its tyres don't wear because they're faulty tyres. The car's tyres wear badly because there's something wrong higher up in the mechanics of the car. There was a bull that I trimmed his feet half a dozen times. This would be, 30 years ago. Trimmed his feet half a dozen times, get him right to go to this show and sale and all that sort of thing. And I think he got a ribbon of some sort, but he sold for $8,000, which was a lot of money then. And the owner rang me up the next day and congratulated me and all that sort of thing. And I felt a bit sick after that, and I haven't trimmed any bull's feet since then. So it was a bit embarrassing to know that I'd put this bull, somebody had paid $8,000 for it, and knew that it wasn't going to work for him. It was going to break down. So I learnt AI when I was 18 and went straight from the course to AI 100 cows. So at the time, this was a pretty reasonable sort of number. So we'd just give them a couple of needles, heat detect them for 3 weeks, and then AI from the heat detection, and then do it for another 3 weeks and chuck a bull out, a cover bull out with them. And it's a bit different now. I didn't know then that there'd be as many AI calves as natural calves born in the seedstock industry, and we'd be able to AI a couple of 200 or 300 cows in a day. So things changed rapidly there. It was about now that embryo transferring became successful enough to start using on farms. So, we're talking 25, 30 odd years ago. And the top cows would be joined to the top bulls, and 5 or 6 champion calves would be born. So when I first came across the embryo transplanting job, it was the show fellas, like I was quite involved with the showing with my father and that sort of thing. And if they could get a broad ribbon and join it to a cow that got a broad ribbon, just expected the calves to be fantastic. So the trouble was no one really knew then which were the top cows and which were the top bulls to do this embryo transplanting with. So you could take cattle to shows time and time after again. With one judge you'd win these bloody ribbons, and the next judge you'd come last. So we've sort of progressed on a bit there. I think they sort of decided we'd better start measuring these things and get a bit more consistency. We would never even have thought then that some breeders would one day have over 1,000 registered cows and breed 35% or so of their calves from 3 or 4% of their cows. So the little red squiggle on Max's curve there is what not a lot, I've got probably 3 or 4 breeders that are doing that, so they might have 300 or 400 embryo calves running around. So they are taking that end of that red squiggle out with their cows and using them to breed 35% of their calves. So that, if you want rapid genetic gain, that is the way of doing it. But there is obviously mistakes are made, but in that when you've got 300 or 400 embryo calves, obviously the mistakes are small. But if you've only got 20 embryo calves and you have a dud joining, then it's a big mistake. That's your rapid genetic gain. I was in Western Australia when I was about 18 and first heard of this thing called breed plan. It all sounded a bit foreign to me, although I did start to think about it. So it's over there, and there was just starting to get a bit more common knowledge of breed plan, and Some breeders started to take it on board, thinking they could use the figures and not know much else and breed top show cattle. So, I think they thought there was something that was going to help them win ribbons or something, but combine this sort of lack of knowledge with the embryo transfer, and you can imagine what the results were like. So there's some pretty hideous sort of cattle were produced in that way, and I think a lot of people in those early days were actually turned off breed plan because it wasn't being used appropriately. People didn't understand how to use it, and people thought they were going to rush in and do something amazing with it. So it was the first lesson that you had to have a fair understanding of cattle to be able to use these figures. So it was one of the things, I had to put some questions to these kids down there, and one of the things I stated was, is it more important to have a good sound knowledge of cattle, or is it more important to have a good sound knowledge of being able to use the figures? Most of them picked one or the other, but a few of them said both, which was right. I was about 21 when I met a girl from Tamworth, and so I thought, oh well, this is a good opportunity to get up to Tamworth and go and see what the cattle were like up there. And my father gave me a phone number for a bloke who worked on a Simmental stud nearby, and thought he might give me a bit of work. So I rang this guy up, and it just happened to be the stocky little Scotchman that came over and worked for Dad when he was 20, and Dad worked for his parents when he was 20, so I ended up working for this Scotchman over there on a Simmental stud when I was 20. And instead of mixing stuff with a shovel in a bathtub, I was driving around on a tractor and feeding all these great big Simmentals that were huge animals. They ate a lot, but didn't have a lot of fat on them. So that's sort of changed a lot now. These European cattle these days are a lot more moderate frame, and by using that information available have maintained their muscle but have been able to increase the subcutaneous fat, making them easy to look after and finish. So something had to be done with all those big lean animals, and by using this scanning data that's become available, they've been able to select and make them a bit more easier to maintain. And Clive McWilliam's not up here. He was up here before. He's gone down to sell a heifer, but I just put a little bit in here. There's also some polo horses on this Simmental stud that he was working on, and there's a polo groom, little hot chickie babe there that just happened to be a Kiwi. He ended up marrying her, and that's how he got to be over here. So anyway, so it's not very often you get a bit of a love story in one of these sort of turnouts. So after I finished my courting, I ended up marrying the girl that I went up there chasing as well. So there's a couple of little love stories for you. But after I'd finished my courting, I went down south again to work on a stud near Holbrook, and that was probably the first place where really got involved in seriously measuring or weighing cattle for breed plan and learning a bit more about it. So at that stage, the majority of the breeders still weren't convinced breed plan. They weren't convinced breed plan was any good, but a few fanatics, and there's a couple of them here today, persevered and helped make performance recording what it is today. So in early 1989, I moved on and found myself doing a bit of work for a radiologist who bred cattle. So one day he told me about this technology that he'd read about where you could collect carcass data on live animals. So he asked me to come up to, or go up to Armidale and check it out and see what was going on. So that was the start of what's been a 27-year long period that began really as a battle trying to convince people to do it, but has been pretty well, industry changing period in a lot of ways. So virtually since then, every day of my working life, I've actually been hands-on with cattle. So I've been with cattle bloody nearly every day that I've been working. I started using my father's words then. The next 5 years in this industry is going to be very interesting. There's going to be a lot of change. Cattle breeders started weighing and measuring, and progressive commercial producers started to ask the bull breeders for more information on the bulls they were buying. The cost of production was increasing, and people started to realise they needed to increase production to alleviate the rising costs. Producers had to increase fertility and increase the kilos of meat produced per hectare while maintaining the longevity of the animal. This couldn't be done by winning the ribbons at the shows. Some breeds have increased their 600-day weight by over 100 kilos in the period of time that breed plan's been going. All other traits have benefited or increased by the breeders collecting data and using this data in their breeding programs. In Australia, there's approximately 500,000 head of cattle pass through feedlots each year. For over 30 years, they've increased their body weight by an average of 100 kilos, and that's an increase of 50 million kilos of body weight coming out of those feedlots. So Australia's got approximately 24 million head of cattle over there. So if there's 24 million head of cattle, and they've all increased over that period of time by 100 kilos on average, then that is 2.4 billion kilos of extra body weight that's been increased over that time. So whether or not they would have increased in weight without breed plan or not, but breed plan has actually helped increase that weight. This all is pretty good, sounds good if you can maintain longevity. Good structure influences longevity, which I'll talk about soon. So I was accredited to scan cattle in '89, and at this time we could only measure fat depth and eye muscle area. Some of the first jobs I did were measuring bulls at the royal shows. British breeds had too much fat, not enough muscle. European cattle had plenty of muscle but not enough fat. Some of the animals actually have over 40 mils of fat on them, and some would have none. But slowly, by doing this measuring, it started to open the breeders' eyes. There's actually a negative correlation, which someone spoke about today, between muscle and the two fat traits. So subcutaneous fat and intramuscular fat. So everybody thought the idea was to increase muscle, but by doing that, we did increase muscle and reduce fat. We're also decreasing marbling. European cattle breeders started using the measurements to increase fat. We didn't realise we were actually decreasing the marbling while we were increasing the muscling. A few years down the track, we learned how to measure intramuscular fat, percentage or marbling, and started to learn how to use all this information that we were gathering. We all know there's a high correlation between birth weight and final weight, and that was touched on earlier. But generally, a high birth weight calf will go on to have a high 600-day weight. We've been able to change that genetic curve by weighing and selecting animals that have had a low birth weight and a high 600-day weight. We can now produce calves that are born with a low birth weight that have a high 600-day weight given the opportunity. Through breed plan, we know we've increased weight, so that 600-day weight, by about 20%. So that's 20% of the total. But we've only increased the birth weight by about 5 to 8%. So while we have increased the birth weight slightly, the final weight has increased 3-4 times as much. We've been able to change the genetic curve on the carcass traits as well, so by scanning thousands and thousands of animals. So I think I've probably scanned somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 head. So in Australia, there's probably, it works out to be over 1 million since we've been scanning. So there's a lot of stuff being scanned, a lot of measurements gone in. So we've done that. And by scanning thousands and thousands of animals, then selecting animals or bloodlines that have high muscle as well as high intramuscular fat, we've been, as well as the high IMF, and also have the subcutaneous fat cover we require. We're now starting, and I mean starting, to breed cattle that are increasing the muscle, controlling subcutaneous fat, increasing marbling, and getting a better carcass yield and increasing carcass weight. So there's a cow over there that I read in one of the newsletters that someone's scouting about at the moment that is the highest cow in the breed for eye muscle area and in the top 5% for IMF. So we're actually regularly finding animals that can do similar things to that. We're improving, but we've got a long way to go. So look at, I think someone's a pig breeder or something here. So look at what they can do. They can hang up 100 carcasses and have them all very similar. So the cattle job's got a fair way to go before we can do that. We all know that the Asians are getting a taste of the meat, but they just don't want a bit of mince or whatever. They're after the quality beef that they can sit down and enjoy and, at a restaurant or at home, and then do that time and time again. So it's the quality beef that we need to produce for them, and we're actually getting there. It's okay to lift the production and improve the quality of our product by collecting all this data, by weighing, scanning, measuring. It's all good if the animals can survive or do what they're meant to do. So in my early days of scanning, I was asked if I'd be interested in working with the crew at Armidale on what was called the validation project. It involved scanning, measuring, structural assessing. So I jumped at the chance, and we had a meeting with some of the leading members in the industry to see what traits should be addressed. So you can imagine me, a sort of young fella, 20-odd-year-old, in a room with about 20 experts and all wanting to prove that they're experts. So it was a bit daunting for me, but we got there in the end. So you can only imagine, just how I had to deal with all these experts. It was eventually decided what traits would be observed. So all the scanning traits were right, the hip heights and pelvic measuring, scrotal size and all that sort of thing. And various structural traits on the feet and legs, and we even looked at pin width and pin height and hair texture and a few others. The traits that we could actually measure weren't a problem. It was the traits we had to give a subjective score was the problem. We knew what we were looking at, but we didn't really record it in a way that could be analysed in the early days of doing this sort of work. The findings from the project were that most of the objectively measured traits could be used in a genetic analysis. But after measuring about 40, we did pelvic size, I did about 40,000 pelvic measurements over the 5 years, and it was found the bigger framed animals had bigger pelvises. So they decided that, to fix any calving problems, you just needed to use the right bulls, control nutrition and cull anything that had trouble calving. But I wish they'd have just told me that before I did the 40,000 pelvic measurements. The structural stuff was a failure. We didn't record it properly. So in that initial project that was run, we knew what we were looking at. We just didn't put it on paper in a way that could be analysed. So I'd been in this industry for about 8 years by then and had taken a lot of scrotal measurements as well. So I've taken a lot more since. It's not the favourite part of my job. In fact, it drives me nuts. They said the Kiwis wouldn't get that, but at a rough estimate, I would have done 70 or 80,000 scrotal measurements or 160,000 testicles have been through these hands. So I've been mucking around with it for a while. Initially, the idea was the bigger the better. Realistically, I think as long as they're above the minimum size and are sound, they should be okay. It's just interesting with the work that's being done that they're saying that the bigger they are, the earlier their sisters would reach puberty. So there must be some data to back that up, or they wouldn't be saying that. So, but obviously, your semen tests are the ultimate test. We do have one-nutters and deformities occasionally, but we're not sure how heritable this is. So obviously any sires that are one-nutters aren't going to be breeding, so we can't sort of work it out too well. But sometimes the bulls are born like that, and sometimes it's due to some sort of injury or something happening to them. So over the time, we've definitely increased scrotal size and the knowledge of fertility through that area. Not long after that validation project, I was approached by a technical breeding group to do a similar structural assessment program. So before we started this time, I went to the experts at the time, which were the dairy guys. So I went and spent a couple of weeks with the dairy guys to see how they went about it, see how they scored it, and went from there. So we adopted a refined version of their structural assessment program. So what happened was I assessed a couple of thousand head over 6 months, which were genetically linked. And then this information was genetically analysed, and all traits which had a high enough heritability and also had a financial effect in the industry were included in the beef class structural assessment program. So that's the program that we use today. The scores we used as actual scores in the catalogues, and eligible animals' data could also be submitted to breed plan for a genetic analysis. some of the herds I've been working with have had me assessing the cattle for over 20 years. So in the early years, I might have culled up to 25% of a bull drop. These same herds I'm still working with now is down to about 2%. So we haven't totally rectified the problem and probably never will, but we've minimised it. So a lot of these heritabilities of these structural traits are similar to the weight and muscle traits, so around that 30%, that sort of thing. A few years ago, trial EBVs were produced for these structural traits, but now they're permanent EBVs that are being produced. So it's funny, a while ago or a few years ago now, the other guy that works with me rang up and said, "Jim, they've just listed the 10 most used sires in one of the breeds in their magazine." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, out of those 10 sires, we know 6 of them are causing big problems structurally." I said, "All right." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "Oh, it's terrible." I said, "Oh, well." I said, "Liam, this is going to keep us employed and keep the money coming in for years to come to try and fix this." So, he felt a bit better after that. But at the time, we were just going out and scoring, and the information belonged to the breeder, and it wasn't for us to go and say, "Yeah, that bull's no good," or whatever, because we didn't own the information. So, but now with the EBVs being produced, the breeders can make their own choices, look at the information available, and decide themselves whether their feet are right or whatever. So it's just funny that a long time ago, I used to trim their feet to try and make them structurally sound, but now we just cut their throats. So we've moved on a long way from there. I'll just hit quickly on your net feed intake or feed efficiency. The question's been asked for many years, how many kilos of feed does it take to produce a kilo of body weight? The answer is each animal is different. So in a feedlot situation, we can calculate how much feed a group of cattle has eaten to produce how much body weight, but to do so on an individual animal is a slow and costly process. So they are starting to get a bit of knowledge from gene testing, but still need to physically weigh and feed the animals individually to get this information. There are net feed take facilities over in Australia that are collecting this information, but it's very slow and very costly. The initial indications are that more feed efficient animals may be a smaller, leaner type of animal. So this is not necessarily the type of animal we want to produce, so we may need to, once again, change that genetic curve by selecting animals that have greater feed efficiency, adequate weight, adequate fat cover, adequate marbling, and whatever other traits are desirable. So it's, we're working on it, but it's a long, slow process. So the gene testing, so that's sort of been hit on a few times, and I just thought I'd touch on it and just give you my point of view of it. I've been to plenty of these seminars where the gene testing's been broached and people have talked about it, and different people have different ideas of how important it is or how accurate it is and that sort of thing. But I've absolutely no doubt that in the future that gene testing will supply breeders with the majority of the information we need to make breeding decisions on different traits. When we first started gene testing, it was announced that the marbling gene had been found and you could make decisions on that information. Now we know that there are hundreds of genes, if not thousands, that influence each trait. The information being provided from gene testing is influential if you have no other information. For herds which have a large database, the gene testing is beneficial but not so influential. Maybe in 10 years' time we'll look back on our current time and realise we've learnt a lot about the previous 10 years as we do now about the last 10 years. My advice to anybody in the breeding industry is to gene test as much as possible, but be tentative about how much emphasis you place on the information. As I said before, in the future it'll be our main way of collecting genetic information in the seed stock industry. I'm just not sure how long it's going to take to get to that time. So cattle have changed a lot in the last 50 years, but I think that a lot of change is yet to come. We have increased weights, we've improved carcass, we've improved structure, we've improved fertility, we've increased longevity, we've changed many things. We've done this by weighing, scanning, scoring, gene testing, and generally collecting any information possible. Anyone who thinks that they've got their cattle in the situation that they want them is going to get left behind. Next 5 years in this industry is going to be very interesting. So that it's funny, I've got a mate over there, we're having a beer one day and he explained to me that all these figures and things are all bullshit. He said, I only have to look at the cattle with my eyes and I know if they're any good or not. So I didn't say anything to him at the time, but that night I went home and had a few more beers and had a bottle of wine and wrote him a poem. So I'm just going to read you this poem that I wrote to him. He hasn't really talked to me a lot since, but anyway, it's called It's All Bull. So I got a great new sire at the Dubbo stud bull sale, nice smooth coat and bright eyes, although his balls were slightly pale. He was big and heavy, his feet were nice and trim, his tail was nice and bushy, I'd paid a lot for him. A long bull and athletic, his head he held so high, he walked around so proudly, oh my, oh my, oh my. I asked my mate across the road whether he would take a share. Oh my, oh my, oh my, he said, I love that bull's smooth hair. A few more mates and their wives I brought in on the deal. We counted all our money, we thought we got him for a steal. Semen was collected, there was a lot of that. We milked and milked and milked till we filled the old milk vat. The semen was distributed to all of those who paid, who wanted to share the privilege to have their best cows laid. The semen was top quality, the cows were all in calf. We all had grins from ear to ear, we were winners not by half. Time it came and time it went, the time was coming near, for all those super calves to be born. I just can't wait, my darling dear. The first cow joined, we watched and watched, we put her in the shed, and bugger me, the dirty bitch, the calf she had was dead. More and more these calves were born, but most of them were late. They were quickly dead and buried. I wish we'd had that bull's birth weight. A few nice calves survived, and on they grew, and then I skided to my friends, he was a good bull I knew. On these calves did grow, but all the others they were better. By now I was both pissed and glum, it was time to write a letter. To Jim I wrote, please help me, for this bull I paid a song. The calves that weren't dead were shithouse, please tell me where I went wrong. I really paid a lot of money for a bull I thought was great. All calves were dead or failures, please help me, Jim, old mate. For days and days I waited from Jim a full report. It was sympathy I needed about that bloody bull I bought. In due course he did reply. With relief I opened up the letter, but as I read and read and read, the results could have been much better. No sympathy did I receive, and he is right, I won't deny. Most bulls that are born are failures when they're only bought by eye. Right.